It's time to explore what intent action does and how to set the action. We'll also look at intent data as well as Mime Type and intent category. An intent action gives a high-level description of the work you need performed. Some actions are very specific. For example, the call action places a phone call. The airplane mode settings action opens the airplane mode panel in the device settings, and the still image camera action opens the camera to take a photo. Other actions are not very specific. In fact, the actions you use most of the time are quite general. For example, the view action is used to launch the browser, show a location on a map, or play music. The send to action is used to send an email or a text message, and the pick action is used to let the user select an image, a contact, etc. This means the action by itself is usually not sufficient to determine which activity should service your request. The action does narrow things down for Android, though, potentially eliminating entire groups of activities. Actions are specified using strings, and the intent class has predefined strings for many common actions. Hard-coded action strings in your app are error-prone, so Android defines many symbolic constants you should use. Strings for specialized actions are typically included in the classes that work with those operations. For example, Media Store has an action string for photo and video capture, Alarm Clock has action strings for timer and alarm operations, and Settings has action strings to open the settings panel, like the airplane mode setting we just mentioned. You have two choices to set an intent action. You can pass a string to the constructor, or you can call the setAction method and pass a string, typically one of those predefined constants. Intent data is a single piece of information you load into an intent for use by the target activity. The Android documentation will generally tell you what to use for the data. For example, the phone dialer expects its data to be phone number it should dial. The web browser expects a web address it should load. In some cases, the data helps Android decide which activity to launch for you. For example, the combination of action view and data having an HTTP scheme would cause Android to launch the web browser activity. But the combination of action view and data with a geo scheme tells Android to launch a map activity. It's not your job to determine what to use for these data formats. Android documentation will generally tell you exactly what the data should look like. As with the intent's action, you have two choices to set the intent's data. You can provide the data as a parameter to one of your constructor overloads, or you can call the setData method and pass a URI. Note the data is an Android URI, so you'll want to use the parse method to convert a string to an Android URI. The Mime type indicates the type of data you want the intent to manipulate, and it helps Android determine which activity to launch. The Android documentation will generally tell you what to use for the Mime type. For example, if you're sending the details for a new calendar event, you can use the Mime type to tell Android you want to find an activity that can receive your event and load it into the calendar. Or if you're asking Android to let the user select a file, you can specify what type of file you're looking for example, an image. Remember, it's not your job to determine what to use for the Mime type. The documentation will generally tell you exactly what to use and when to use it. You'll use the setType method on an intent to set the Mime type. Note that setData and setType are mutually exclusive. Calling either of them clears the value set by the other. There is a separate setDataAndType method for the rare cases where you need to set both. A category is a group of activities that share some characteristic. For example, activities that act as a settings panel would declare they belong to a preferences category. A category restricts the kind of activity you would like to handle your intent. Every activity that offers its services to other activities can specify that they belong to one or more categories. When you create an intent, you optionally say you only want activities from a certain category to handle your request. In other words, a category can limit which activities Android will even consider as a match for your request. If your intent includes multiple categories, Android will further restrict activities that declare they're a member of all the categories you listed. To launch most activities, you will not need to set a category of your intent at all. You'll use the addCategory method on an intent to add one or more categories. You can call the method multiple times if you need to add more than one category. Categories are specified using strings, and again, the intent class defines symbolic constants for the standard categories. Intent data only lets you pass a single piece of information to an activity you're starting. Sometimes that's not enough. Extras allow you to provide multiple pieces of information. For example, when starting the email compose activity, you might want to pass the recipient's address, the subject, some starter text for the message body. You'll use intent extras to pass this type of information. Extras are specified using strings. A few predefined strings are in the intent class, but most are packaged in the classes they work with. Again, documentation is often the best way to determine which extras to use with your intents. The putExtra method on an intent allows you to add one or more of these extras. You can call the method multiple times to include all the data your target activity might need.